I am now joined by Tracy Williams. She is an author, podcaster, and educator. Welcome to the Black Book Show, Tracy.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Tracy Williams. I originally was born in Luton, Bedfordshire, and I currently live in Watford, UK, and I work as a school leader of a largish primary school in East London. So I am really busy with the work that I do. I do a lot of commuting most days. I come from a large family. My grandparents are of the Windrush generation, so I'm probably second generation West Indian. They came over in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and I was brought up by my grandparents. My parents had me when they were quite young, so I was brought up by my grandparents, and it was through them that they fostered within me a love of reading, a love of history. I've always loved looking at the past, but also a love of music as well. So apart from loving reading and writing, I'm also into music. I like to sing. I like to write songs. I like to record my music as well. So there's a lot of facets, a lot of interests to my disposition and to my personality. I come from quite a large family. I'm one of 10 siblings. I'm the oldest of 10 siblings, and I've had quite an interesting childhood. My school days were quite happy. I went to university and did a teaching degree, and did that in London. And I think I started my teaching degree when I was about 21, went down to London and pretty much stayed down there. And that's where I have spent all of my working life, really, just working in schools across central London, in Brent, in Westminster, and now I'm based in East London, and I've been there for several years now, and I really enjoy educating children from a range of backgrounds and sharing with them what I have learned in my own learning journey. So that's pretty much about me, really.
You're an author, hence the reason why you're on the Black Book Show. You've written, not one book, not two book, not three book, but you've written, several books. So what I would like you to do is to tell the listeners the titles of the books that you've written, and also if you could just give us an overview of, each of the books that you've written as well, so the audience, knows more about the what you've written.
Well, the books that I've written come under the concept of the title Stories to be Told, TOLLED. It's basically a series of concept books that aim to teach young people and teach children about the British Empire and Britain's colonial past. And so far, there are 8 books in the series. The first one that I published back in 2020, actually, the first 4 that were published back in 2020, was Caribbean Wind. And that is like an ode to the Windrush generation. It's quite apt that, we've celebrated our 75th anniversary of the Windrush. So I did a special podcast episode on that quite recently. The second book was called Caribbean Rush, and that goes back to the 14th and 15th centuries, and it's a perspective about England's first encounter with the Caribbean before the Caribbean became colonized by the French and the Spanish, as well as the British. The third book is called Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and that's a perspective on the scramble for Africa, which happened through the Berlin Conference in 1884. And that was at a time when it was after slavery. It was about 50 years after slavery. And the European powers, as they have been termed quite often, decided that Africa was rich in human and natural resources, and they were all gathering together to work out how they were going to carve up Africa and share out Africa amongst themselves. The fourth book is called Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. And that is a theme that comes up quite a lot in my podcast series. And that's all about a time in history where it's about the early 60s, and that was a period of great change across the world. And a lot of British colonies, as well as European colonies across Africa and Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent, there was a lot of political unrest. A lot of the indigenous population were rising up and wanting to take back their land and take back their political system and take ownership of their culture again. And it was a period of nationalism, nationalistic pride, and Britain was becoming very well aware of the fact that its empire was deteriorating and was coming to an end. And it's very much about the speech that the Prime Minister at the time, Harold Macmillan, gave in Accra, Ghana, and then he gave the speech again in South Africa. And it was all about this metaphorical wind of change that was coming in, and that Britain and the rest of Europe need to recognize that the colonial era is about to come to an end. So that's quite an interesting one. So that's the first four books. And then in July last year, I published four more titles. The first one of those to be published, which is the fifth now in the Stories to be Told series, was called The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, this particular story is really right at the end of the British colonial timeline, because Hong Kong was the last known colony to be relinquished by the British. And it goes back in time to when Britain first acquired Hong Kong through the first and second opium wars in China. And Britain acquired this port, often called Victoria Harbour, from China in 1898. And it acquired it through a 99-year lease, and in 1997 Britain honoured the end of this lease and basically gave back Hong Kong to China. So that's what that story is all about. And then I decided to go across to the Atlantic and look at New York, look at the beginnings of New York, and explore a perspective on the whole colonial process that happened in America with the 13 colonies, and how Africans were enslaved and brought over to work within those colonies. But I focus particularly on New York because there's always this myth that it was a lot more lenient, and a lot more, there was a lot more freedom for Africans up in the north. Kind of look at the whole thing through a different perspective to say, well, the grass wasn't always so green up in the north. And we always hear stories about enslaved Africans trying to escape from the south and trying to make their way up to the north, where there was more freedom, a lot more freedom. But this story kind of turns that on its head, and you get it from a slightly different perspective. So that's called Bite from the Big Apple, a story for New York. The seventh title is called Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix. And that's all about, that goes back to Africa again. And I was inspired to write that story when I was taking a closer look at the history of Zimbabwe, the culture of Zimbabwe, and how Zimbabwe in centuries past had experienced this kind of golden era where it was a great center of economics and of trade, and this great seat of learning. And how, in contrast to what had happened to it by through being colonized by the British, and then going through the struggles of civil war to try and break free from British control, and how in recent times, over the previous 4 decades since it acquired its independence, it has not really lived up to its own expectations. So that's a story about that whole journey that particular country has gone through. And by the end of the story, I kind of asked the question, well, what's the future? What's next for this country that used to be this great citadel? It used to be known as the breadbasket of Africa. Can they reclaim their past to achieve a brighter and better future for its people? So that's the seventh book. And then the last book that I have written is called A Story for South Africa. And A Story for South Africa is, again, it follows a similar pattern to Zimbabwe. I've always been interested in South Africa. I've always wanted to go to South Africa. And it follows that pre-colonial timeline. And then when the English came and colonized it, and the Dutch coming inland from the established port in Cape Town. And it was all about the conflict between the British and the Dutch that was played out on the land of the indigenous South African people, like the Bantu tribes that had been there for thousands of years. And all of a sudden, you've got Europeans coming onto the land and trying to fight for the diamonds and the gold that had been discovered there, and the gradual demise and enslavement of these tribes, and how they get caught up within the conflict. Period of apartheid, and they've gone through this truth and reconciliation phase, and you wonder what's next. How are these countries or former colonies in Africa, how will their people now come together and build a brighter future? How will they come together and achieve that economic, that financial, that cultural and social and moral stability again, now that we are in a post-colonial era? So those are the 8 stories that are currently out at the moment.